Hey, this is Chris Franco, and you are listening to Compound Money Quietly, the CMQ Investing Podcast. CMQ investors, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. It is undeniable that we are living through an inflationary episode right now. That is just the reality. And one of the most popular slogans in this reality that we're living through is the cash is trash. I'm sure you've heard people say this. I know I hear people say it all the time. And generally, I've just been feeling this pressure to hold as little cash on the sidelines as humanly possible, as if any amount of cash that I'm not doing something with is somehow like a leech that's going to compromise my future net worth. In this episode, I'm going to share with you some unconventional wisdom that I discovered, first through my own instincts, and then through one of the classic investing books by Phil Fisher. I think what I'm going to share with you will have a positive impact on your long-term returns. I obviously can't prove that, and this is not financial advice, but I can say that it's helping me as a long-term investor, and I certainly hope that it helps you the same way. With all that said, though, let's get to it. There are plenty of things that you could do with your cash that are worse for your cash than inflation is. As many of you know from listening to past episodes, and I think I specifically spoke about this in the inversion episode, but I am a big believer in having an emergency savings account. In October of this year, I started adding to that savings account. Now, I previously kept anywhere from 6 to 12 months worth of living expenses. Now, as I'm recording this right now, my emergency savings account has a little over 2 years worth of living expenses. The utility of my emergency savings is really simple. It's there to ensure that I can pay my bills if, God forbid, I have an emergency that keeps me from working. But I want to speak about a different way that savings account serves me, specifically how it serves me as a long-term investor. I find that having that cash position keeps me from panic selling. It protects me from the disposition effect, which is one of the mistakes we covered in the episode 9 Major Investing Mistakes that every investor should know about. So that extra cash protects me from the disposition effect, and specifically from selling winners too soon. Even more generally, it keeps me from interrupting the compounding process. Now, a little bit more context here, because I think of this as like a cognitive cushion. So the context will help because not everyone needs the same amount of cushion. At the start of the year, I was managing 50% of my money. Today, as I'm recording this right now, I now manage 100% of my money. And by doing that, I'm saving a significant amount of money in the form of fees. But what this also means is I have a larger dollar amount that I'm now investing on my own than ever before. So while I can get my head around that, I'm fully aware that when there's, let's say, a 10% correction, which history has shown come once every 19 months, or at least that's been the case since 1928, if and when that happens, that amount, that 10% is a lot more than I'm used to seeing drop at any given moment. So knowing that's the case, knowing, hey, as much as I think I've got my psychology down, I know the cost of not having it down when I think I do will be a lot more than whatever the cost of inflation is. Let me add a few more details. If all of my money was in, let's say, the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, I think I'd be fine with a 10% correction no matter how much money I was personally managing. However, and you know this if you subscribe to the free newsletter at cmqinvesting.substack.com, which I think you can just get to from cmqinvesting.com, but I sent out an email this weekend showing the details of how my portfolio is constructed. 36% of my portfolio consists of individual stocks. And I know from experience that seeing an individual name, especially one that I've done well with, seeing that take a big dip, well, it can trigger all sorts of stupid behavior because I could easily make the mistake of panic selling. And really the panic is more of an effort just to lock in gains. There's all sorts of studies that show how, we have this tendency to feel smart by securing a gain, and that keeps us from holding something over the long term. Because once it gets volatile, we want to just lock in a profit and feel good about it. But in reality, or I shouldn't say in reality, but in most cases, if you know what you bought and you got it at the right price, you're almost always better off just riding through it. But this additional padding in my emergency savings account is a proven tactic that helps me stay cool if and when things get crazy. I also want to say that keeping the additional year's worth of living expenses on the sidelines is a form of humility. I've said this repeatedly, but overconfidence gets us killed as investors. So by just acknowledging that I might not be able to behave like Charlie Munger despite internalizing much of his investing related wisdom, that is me acknowledging that I could have some shortcomings. And I think that's a healthy thing. My last instinctual thought, if that's even a word, instinctual, was that let's say inflation is deleting 5% of the value of my cash in a given year, and I'm just making up that number based on different articles that I've read. Well, why am I so sure that what I would do with that surplus of emergency savings would be better than that? And again, I think that goes to overconfidence. Earlier this month, I began reading one of the books that Warren Buffett recommends reading from Phil Fisher. It's called Paths to Wealth Through Common Stocks, and it was published in 1960. What Phil Fisher says about inflation resonated with me, and I think it's something that really needs to be heard right now for everyone who's investing, regardless of, what your individual stance is on the role the cash can play in your portfolio. I just think it's time-tested wisdom that I wish I'd known about or I wish I had discovered sooner. Let me read you 2 paragraphs from that book, and then I'll come back to you in my own words. Quote, "The wise investor should get the inflation matter in proper perspective. Long range, I believe this should be his goal. You should have no investments that fail to give promise of at least enough gain to balance the inevitable further shrinkage of the dollar. But short range, he should also realize that selecting the right investment and buying it at the right time is tremendously more important than getting this inflation protection quickly. When an investor has set aside a given sum of money for a given purpose for which he will want to use that money in a relatively few years, I believe he should leave such sums in cash and not try to protect them against inflation. If he has bought the right type of inflation hedge, it may be down in price just when he wants his cash by far more than the relatively modest amount the purchasing value of his original savings would have shrunk in the meantime. Why do so many investors in this inflation-conscious age get almost panicky about holding much cash? They rush in to buy with a total unwillingness to take the time necessary to find a genuinely outstanding investment opportunity. In some cases, this may just be the sign of an impatient or immature individual. Frequently, however, I believe there is something quite different behind their actions: the uncritical acceptance of the widespread fallacy that the tempo of inflation is so sure to increase, so that speed in disposing of cash or its equivalent becomes of paramount importance." End quote. A common characteristic of many of my favorite investors is that they challenge the conventional wisdom of the day. It's not surprising that Phil Fisher would also have this characteristic. Later in the same chapter, Phil Fisher writes the following, quote, "Just because so many accept something as true without further thought on the subject will cause some to feel that any questioning is out of place. To those, I would point out that history has shown that, in every age and in every field of human knowledge, many of the views which almost everyone accepted as true and never bothered to think about further were in time proven completely wrong. It took centuries of civilization before it was realized that the earth went round the sun and not the other way around. Only a generation ago, learned scientists would have ridiculed the idea that even the most solid of objects are almost entirely empty space. Yet today, we know this to be the case. Because something is generally taken for granted, and even though respected leaders and places of power tailor their policies accordingly, this does not of itself make it correct." End quote. Saying that cash is trash, even during inflation, is a ridiculous idea. That's my opinion. That's my unconventional wisdom. If I have money set aside to cover my living expenses for an extended period of time, and that keeps me from panic selling, well, that's worth the cost of inflation. If the market has a crazy correction or even a crash, my strategy, my long-term investment strategy, is not going to be compromised because of my emotions. And that's worth a lot more than whatever it is I may lose just by holding maybe a larger sum of cash than most are comfortable with in this inflationary period. Going back to Phil Fisher, he would say that cash isn't trash if you're holding on to that cash and being patient for a truly great investment opportunity. I also like how he described, the utility of having cash that would be for a short-term expense or something that you're going to need or something you plan to buy, let's say 2 years out. If you put that into some sort of inflation hedge now, and then when you need the money, that inflation hedge has just gone down because that can be the nature of the market in the short term, well, then you may lose more than if you had just kept that money in a checking account. But I don't hear anyone saying this. Everyone seems to have the same point of view. And that's fine. That's why CMQ investing and being a CMQ investor is something that is a little bit different. But just like we learned from Howard Marks about second level thinking, we want to be different and better. And the proof will be in the pudding long term. Now, I want to conclude with something that this episode made me think about. It has nothing to do with investing, but everything to do with investing. It comes from an interview with Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman. Here's what I said about it during a recent live broadcast on Instagram. I'd say what's kept my interest in investing beyond just like, how can I make more money, has been the kind of thinking that goes into it. And specifically the thinking of what I've now discovered to be the best investors of all time. They don't just accept what everyone's doing as the right way to do it. And, I can give an example from a non-investing example here for you guys. There is the Nobel Prize winning physicist, Richard Feynman, who is no longer with us. But I'll never forget this interview that I watched with him, where it was on YouTube I think it was from the 1970s. But he was telling the person interviewing him, he said, and this is not a direct quote, but he said, not that long ago, we used to burn people at the stake, meaning, burn people because we thought they were witches. And, now we look back and we go, oh my God, that's, so barbaric and crazy and stupid and everything else you can think of. What are the witches of today? There are things that we think are true, things that we are doing that will be looked back upon or be looked back at as completely just ridiculous.
You take any crazy idea. I don't know. It's hard to make up a very crazy one. Witches or something like that. And you tell about what people used to believe in witches. And of course, nobody believes in witches now. And you say, how could they believe in witches? Then you turn around and you say, let's see. What witches do we believe in now?
This has been Compound Money Quietly, the CMQ Investing podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you subscribe. And remember what Charlie Munger says. The best thing a human being can do is help another human being know more. I hope this episode did that for you. And if that's the case, then help someone else know more by sharing it with them. My name is Chris Franco. Thank you for listening. We'll talk soon.